Hey, it's Coach Anderson here again from Mississippi Public Broadcasting Online U.S. History from 1877 to present. We've been talking about Unit 10, of course, World War II, Part 1. Remember we said we wanted to divide this one up into two particular parts because how massive the information, of course, in this particular topic is. What we're going to do today, of course, is pick up with Unit 10, Lesson 2, and it's called American Isolationism. And what we're basically going to do is examine why the United States of America at the beginning of World War II does not get involved in the war, and then what prompts us eventually, of course, to get involved. What we're going to do is look at the unit focus questions. We won't answer the unit focus questions, of course, after the lesson. What we will do, of course, is at the end of Part 1 and Part 2, what we'll do is go back and we'll answer these questions. You have two questions here. The first one, of course, is why did efforts to prevent World War II fail? And then second question, well, how did the home front effort bolster American success in World War II? Well, when you look at the first question, it's more or less for Part 1, and the second question for Part 2. What we have now is for the vocabulary, and as we said about the vocabulary all the time, what we want you to do, of course, is to write these terms down and define them yourself, and we'll try to address as many of them as we can, of course, as we go through them in the lesson, but go ahead and write those down, of course, and define them yourself. What we're going to do is look at the two lesson-focused questions that will guide our thought process, of course, through Lesson 2, American Isolationism. The first one is, why did the U.S. continue a foreign policy of isolationism as dictators started their march to authoritarianism in Europe? And two, how did FDR's view of American foreign policy influence American transition from neutrality? So a lot of Americans, of course, were for isolationism, but the one person, the most important person that was not for isolationism was the President of the United States of America at that time, FDR, who believed in something called internationalism. And we'll jump into that in a little bit. First thing we want to do is look at our do now activities. Once again, take out your journals, write down the statement, of course, that we've given you, and then go ahead and respond, of course, to that particular prompt. The topic says, if you were an American citizen in the late 1930s, what might be your personal reasons for supporting or opposing U.S. neutrality at the beginning of World War II? Go ahead and take a few minutes, write those particular responses down, and we'll come back and we'll examine them in just a few moments. Okay, what we've done, of course, is giving you enough time that you were able to go through, of course, and maybe, choose a side to formulate an opinion. And when we're looking at it, it says, what might be your personal reason for supporting or opposing the U.S. neutrality at the beginning of the World War II? Well, one of the biggest things that I would think if I were living in the 1930s, if I were answering this particular question, I think I would more or less be along the same lines, of course, as the President of the United States of America, FDR. And what FDR said is that, United States of America is, we are a world away, of course, and we're separated by two oceans, of course, from Europe and Asia. But the problem with that is that the world is getting smaller because of transportation and advances like airplanes and stuff like that, and because of these big ships now. So even though the problems that are going on in Europe, of course, are their problems, it's very easy to see how those very same problems over there can leak over, of course, into our country. So if I were answering that question, I probably would jump on that side. But if you had to make me jump on the other side, the answer to that question would be, in terms of what might be a reason why I would oppose, is because, once again, why should Americans sacrifice their lives, of course, for everybody else's freedom? And that's the attitude that a lot of people even have even today in 2024. All right, isolationism. Now, this is not the first time that we've seen this topic of isolationism. Before World War I, if you begin it, when World War I began, the United States of America was not involved in World War I. We chose to remain neutral. What we basically said is that the problems, of course, of Europe and the rest of the world are not our problems. But what we found out, of course, even though we try to remain neutral, eventually something happens, of course, that pulls us into it, because the world, of course, is getting smaller. Just as in World War I, the United States chose to remain neutral during the start of World War II. FDR, though, believed in internationalism that we told you about a few seconds ago, and that the U.S. could not isolate itself from the rest of the world. The unpopularity of the war, however, made FDR unable to end isolationism. Even though he wanted to, he could not get the United States of America to go away from isolationism in 1935, though he recognized the problems that Hitler, Mussolini, Francisco Franco, even Joseph Stalin, that they posed, of course, to the rest of the world. So the U.S. passed the Neutrality Acts to prevent American involvement in the foreign wars, and what they were a system, a system of acts that were created that told the United States of America what they could do, what it could do, and what it couldn't do when it came to involvement in the war. One of the most interesting things about it was the United States of America had just emerged, of course, from the Great Depression. And one of the things that FDR did for business, he said that if you want to sell arms or supplies, of course, not arms, but sell supplies, of course, overseas to the warring countries, you could do so, but they had to do it on a cash and carry kind of basis. America First. What we see, of course, is this cartoon here. And what you notice is the lady, of course, is America First. And she looks like a female version of FDR, if you ask me. And it says Adolf the Wolf. She's reading this story, of course. And this is just, and what you basically see is that the kids, of course, are horrified about what they're saying here, but the whole time she's smiling here. So in looking at it, even though we knew the dangers, of course, that were happening in Europe with people like Adolf Hitler, we still resisted the idea of involving American troops in World War II. The road to end of isolationism. With the passage of the Neutrality Act of 1939, the United States allowed American businesses to sell weapons to foreign nations on a cash and carry basis. In December 1940, the U.S. passed the Lend-Lease Act, which allowed Britain and the USSR to rent weapons and pay later for their use. In August 1941, FDR and Churchill met in secret, and signed the Atlantic Charter, which outlined the plan for U.S. involvement and peace post-World War II, even though the U.S. wasn't even in the war yet. So what you see is a transition from, nah, we ain't getting in it, to more and more the United States of America involvement, of course, is growing. So now we see that the United States of America is changing the policy, but we also see who the United States of America prefers, of course, to enter this particular battle or this particular conflict, of course, to support. The Lend-Lease Act. Now, keep in mind when the Lend-Lease Act, of course, was passed in 1941, I believe, we are not in the war, but what we are doing, of course, is we're giving supplies or renting supplies to the countries, of course, who represent our interests. Now, the interesting thing about it is Great Britain, everybody understood that, but the Soviet Union was a communist nation, and we were terrified of communism in the United States of America. But what we recognize is that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So because the Soviets were the enemies of Germany, that must mean that they should be the friends, of course, of the United States. Here you see an eagle, the United States of America, of course, with the stars, of course, across his chest. And it says the happy event, and what they're delivering like a stork would be weapons, planes, cannons, tanks, to anyone, of course, that could protect American interests. The U.S. enters World War II. Just as in World War I, something happens. The United States of America does have to get involved, of course, in this particular war. And what happens, of course, it was the sinking of the Lusitania and the restarting of unrestricted submarine warfare in World War I, where Americans, of course, were killed by German submarines. And in World War II, it's going to be the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 11, 1941. And because of that, because the Japanese, of course, were the allies of Germany and Italy. So when they attack us, we declare war on both Italy, Germany, and of course Japan. Here you see a picture of Pearl Harbor. You see the USS Arizona, USS Vestal, USS Tennessee, USS Maryland, and USS Virginia under attack. The only one of this particular group that sustained enough damage, of course, that it wasn't used during the war and after the war was USS Arizona, along with the USS Oklahoma and the USS Utah. I think the US Oklahoma, I think it or the Utah, one of the two made it and was able to be refurbished and reused, but two of those three did not make it. What we want you to do, of course, is look at the worksheet, of course, that we've provided you with, and what we want you to do is look at the neutrality debate, the U.S. involvement in World War II. And what we want you to do, of course, is to read the following summaries of the two opposing viewpoints on American involvement in World War II, then answer the questions below. Now, once again, we won't go over these specifically, but your teacher, of course, will have the reference slide at the end of the unit, and she can go through, of course, after you answer these questions, she can give you some feedback and, of course, give you a grade for the work that you've completed. What we're going to do here is look at the lesson focus question, and what the lesson focus question is why did the U.S. continue a foreign policy of isolationism as dictators started their march to authoritarianism in Europe? And how did FDR's view of American foreign policy influence the American transition for neutrality? Well, we have some pretty good ideas in terms of why it is that we kind of make these transitions. But what we want you to understand is this here. Americans were reluctant to get involved in the affairs of Europe because American lives, of course, would be lost. And in the minds of most Americans, it would be that they were fighting for somebody else's freedom. So the answer to those questions, public opinion was swayed by the NYE committee, which made the argument that business, or the NYE committee, that business quest for profits drew the U.S. into World War I, and the fact that Americans didn't want Americans dying for on foreign shores for other people's freedoms. So a lot of people were cynical about World War I. They said that the reason why the United States of America got involved in it was so that rich people could make money, and they didn't like the idea of poor American boys going overseas, of course, to fight in a war for somebody else's freedom, and they didn't want to see that happen again. How did FDR's view of American foreign policy influence the American transition from neutrality? His belief in internationalism coupled with the idea that war production would create jobs and prosperity in the United States. Understand something. We had just gotten out of the throes of the Great Depression. And the one thing that Americans, of course, needed was jobs, of course, and money. And the two things that that could be provided by involvement in the war, of course, was the creation of jobs and, of course, money to be made. So, because of those two things, we're going to find that America is going to move more towards, less towards neutrality and more towards, of course, involvement in World War II. Once again, this is Coach Anderson here at Mississippi Public Broadcasting Online, U.S. History from 1877 to present. And what we want you to understand is this here. We have offered you what we know to be the case, of course, when it comes to World War II. But please do your own research, because remember, if it's America's history, it's your history, and you should be able to do your own research, draw your own conclusions, and we'll see you next time.